Governments can now spend at will to finance wars or invest in the economy, but this family is in no way ordinary. Behind every significant moment in history, there are hidden forces at play. These forces, often invisible to the public, are orchestrated by the world's wealthiest and most powerful families. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, JP Morgan, these names are synonymous with financial dominance, but beneath their wealth lies a web of manipulation, deception, and a concerted effort to keep power in the hands of a select few. It is said that history is written by the victors, but what if we told you it is shaped by the wealthy elites who influence not just the outcomes of wars, but the very structures that govern our economies and societies? This is a story of hidden control, where major events like the creation of the Federal Reserve, the Titanic disaster, and even the assassination of JFK are part of a much larger conspiracy. A conspiracy designed to keep the rich rich and prevent the decentralization of power. Chapter 1. The 16th Amendment, a new form of enslavement. While the Emancipation Proclamation may have ended physical slavery, it did little to address the economic systems that would continue to bind people in servitude. The true shift from physical to economic bondage came with the passage of the 16th Amendment in 1913. While it was presented as a way to ensure the wealthy paid their fair share, it created a system that economically enslaved the masses through debt, an invisible chain that kept people dependent on a financial system controlled by the elite. The newly freed population after the Civil War found themselves trapped in an economic system of sharecropping and debt as they struggled to make a living in a devastated economy. This economic control was far more subtle, but equally as effective in keeping people bound. The wealthy elite realized that maintaining control over the working class through debt was more profitable than traditional ownership. In 1913, the 16th Amendment allowed for the federal income tax, designed to raise revenue for the government. It was sold as a way to make the rich pay their fair share, but in reality, it burdened the working class. Taxes were levied directly on wages, and with the rise of consumer debt, most Americans found themselves financially strapped, working harder just to make ends meet. The true result of the 16th Amendment was the creation of a perpetual cycle of debt, a new form of economic enslavement. Instead of physical chains, citizens became bound by the need to pay taxes and debts that they were forced into utilizing just to get by. The wealthiest families, including the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, who controlled the financial system, were the real beneficiaries, securing their power and influence while keeping the population dependent on a system they had no control over. Chapter 2. The Rothschild Legacy. The roots of this conspiracy stretch back to the late 18th century, when Mayer Amschel Rothschild, a German banker, began to carve out an empire that would extend across Europe. Mayer's genius was not just in banking, but in understanding that true power lies in controlling the flow of money. His master plan was set in motion when he sent his 5 sons across the world, like pawns on a chessboard, to establish banking houses in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples and Frankfurt, creating a global financial network that dominated the wealth of nations. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschild family had already cemented their place as the silent power, the invisible king of Europe's finances. And with their wealth, they funded both sides of conflicts, profiting from more than just the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, World War I and II, and some even suggest they profited from the Franco-Prussian War, as well as the Gulf and Iraq wars. The thing is, they made profits regardless of the outcome. The Rothschilds understood something that few others did. Control of money means control of everything. While monarchs and politicians came and went, the Rothschilds remained. They made fortunes during wars, and when peace was restored, they shaped the financial systems that underpinned economic recovery. In the United States, however, a different breed of financial power was making its move. JP Morgan, whose name would become synonymous with wealth and influence in the American financial system. Morgan was no stranger to the Rothschilds. In fact, his rise to prominence was intricately linked to the global banking network established by them. He was the American counterpart to the Rothschilds, and just like them, he understood that controlling the economy meant controlling the government. Chapter 3. The Titanic Conspiracy. In the early 20th century, a tragedy occurred that would forever be etched into history: the sinking of the Titanic. While the official story was that the Titanic collided with an iceberg, theories surrounding the event suggest that there was more to the sinking than a simple accident. The Titanic, built by the White Star Line, owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, and had strong ties to J.P. Morgan. Morgan had massive financial interests in the ship, and although he had originally planned to travel aboard the Titanic, he mysteriously cancelled his trip at the last minute. What makes the Titanic disaster particularly suspicious is the presence of several key figures aboard, men like John Jacob Astor IV and Isidor Straus, among other prominent magnates who were opposed to the creation of a centralized banking system, the Federal Reserve. Astor, a real estate magnate, and Straus, the co-owner of Macy's, well, they were vocal critics of the financial monopoly being established by these banking elites. Some theorists believe that their deaths, along with those of other passengers who opposed centralized banking, were no mere coincidence. The sinking of the Titanic, which took the lives of these influential individuals, removed obstacles to the plans of the banking elite, specifically J.P. Morgan. The Titanic eliminated critics who posed a threat to the Federal Reserve's creation just 1 year later. It very well may have been a deliberate strike designed to remove anyone who could impede the rise of a centralized financial system, where private bankers controlled the issuance of currency, interest rates, and ultimately, the entire economy. Chapter 4: The Tool of the Elite. It's well known that President JFK was assassinated, but we'll go deeper into his link in all of this in a bit. In the years following JFK's assassination, the US dollar continued to be the world's reserve currency, but it was increasingly decoupled from the gold standard. President Franklin Roosevelt effectively ended the gold standard in 1933, eliminating American convertibility of currency into gold. By 1971, President Richard Nixon officially abandoned the gold standard, which had been the foundation of the Bretton Woods system established after World War II. This marked the beginning of the era of fiat currency, where money was no longer tied to any physical asset, but was instead backed by trust in the government and central banks. For the Rothschilds and other financial elites, this was a dream come true. With fiat currency, central banks could print money at will, controlling inflation, interest rates, and the flow of capital. The US government could now create money without the need for a tangible backing, which meant that the elite could continue to lend money to governments, dictate terms, and ensure that their wealth would continue to grow exponentially. Chapter 5: The Federal Reserve and the Consolidation of Power. April 14th, 1912, the Titanic sank. December the 23rd, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, establishing the Federal Reserve, a privately owned institution, an independent entity from the government, tasked with controlling the US money supply on the surface. It was portrayed as a necessary step to stabilise the economy. In reality, it was a monopolistic shift that handed over control of the nation's currency to a very small group of private bankers. The Federal Reserve Act was passed with the support of J.P. Morgan and members of the Rothschild family, who, if you remember, had long believed that control of monetary systems was the key to maintaining their financial empires. For many years, the Federal Reserve has been a critical tool in shaping the global economy, with its policies affecting everything, from interest rates and even inflation. The idea of fiat currency, money that is not backed by tangible assets like gold, was born from this centralization. The Federal Reserve became the primary mechanism for controlling the flow of money, and as it grew more powerful, so did the wealth and influence of the few who controlled it. Now here's where it gets interesting. You might say this is where it all hits the fan. The centralized system of the Federal Reserve wasn't just about maintaining financial control. Its other mechanism was preventing decentralization. The system ensured that ordinary people, businesses, and even governments remained reliant on the central banking system, where a few families controlled the means of production and distribution of money, thus keeping the rich propped up in their castles and everyone else subservient to them. Chapter 6: JFK's challenge to the system. Fast forward to the 1960s, and the Kennedy administration, specifically John F. Kennedy, challenged the centralized system of the Federal Reserve. JFK, the 35th President of the United States, understood the dangers of a privately owned central bank. Kennedy recognized that the Federal Reserve was a tool for financial elites to consolidate their power, and he knew that breaking their grip on the economy would require bold strategies. In 1963, President Kennedy executed a move, Executive Order 11,110, which authorized the US Treasury to issue silver-backed certificates. This move would essentially bypass the Federal Reserve because it offered a direct alternative to the central banking system. Kennedy's executive order was a threat to the very core of the centralized system and the financial elites, and many believe it was an intentional and direct move to weaken the power of the Federal Reserve and the banking families in control of it. But Kennedy's actions came at a cost. Shortly after signing the order, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. For many theorists, his death remains shrouded in mystery, pointing to his challenge of the Federal Reserve as the catalyst for his assassination. J.P. Morgan, the Rothschilds, and other banking families had a vested interest in keeping the Federal Reserve System intact. Kennedy's actions threatened their monopoly on financial power, and his death effectively eliminated the threat to the centralized financial system they had built, allowing it to continue to maintain control. The final piece. Going into the 21st century, the battle for decentralized finance carried on, with new players entering that battlefield, using their voices to challenge the entrenched power of the financial elite. Cryptocurrency, with its promise of a peer-to-peer financial system that does not rely on central banks, has become the battleground for the future of global finance. Of course, the financial elite is not sitting idle. They have always controlled the narrative, and they are not about to let decentralized power upend the system they've worked for centuries to build. The rise of Bitcoin, XRP, and other digital currencies present an existential threat to the power of the Federal Reserve and the banking families that pull the strings. Cryptocurrencies are designed to break free from the control of centralized financial institutions, offering individuals the ability to own their money without relying on banks. A system of this nature would essentially free the people from enslavement by the elite. Because remember, for as long as you are in debt, you are a slave. The battle for decentralization is far from over. The financial elite have vast resources at their disposal. Resources that can be used to manipulate markets, influence political decisions, and control the development of financial technologies. The question remains, will the forces of decentralization be able to overcome the entrenched power of the elite that has held its grip for centuries? Or will they continue to shape the future of finance to preserve their dominance for centuries to come? As part of his broader economic vision, the 47th President-elect has frequently discussed dismantling the influence of the Federal Reserve over the US economy. He has criticized its monetary policies, including interest rate hikes and its control over inflation. His rhetoric and policies are becoming increasingly aligned with a radical shift in America's financial landscape. Once dismissive of cryptocurrency, he now advocates for it as a powerful tool to challenge the established financial order. His proposal to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve, a stockpile of the cryptocurrency to combat inflation and reduce national debt, marks a dramatic departure from traditional economic strategies. Behind this bold stance lies a belief that the current financial system, dominated by institutions like the Federal Reserve, is no longer serving the people, but rather the interests of the elite. By easing regulatory restrictions and positioning crypto as an alternative to the weakening US dollar, he is championing a vision of decentralization that seeks to return power to the individual. As his campaign continues, his advocacy for cryptocurrency signals a potential watershed moment in the fight for a financial revolution. Whether this vision will lead to a new economic era or unravel the foundations of the existing system remains uncertain, but it is clear that the stakes have never been higher. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and watch another one. You won't believe the origins of Kellogg's cereal, or even the history of Chex and its cult origins. See you next time.